It's always good to have a privilege such as this, and I'm glad for the presence of each of you, members of the body of Christ here, members of the body of Christ who might be visiting with us, and friends from the community. I want to assure each of you, as your speaker on this occasion, my deep gratitude for your being here. And while I realize that you've not come simply for the purpose of hearing me, but we've all come together, I trust, for the purpose of worshiping God, it's still thrilling to be able to stand before you on this occasion. I never take a position like this without I think of what a wonderful opportunity this is, and at the same time what a tremendous responsibility, for as I've said before, if I should teach you that which is wrong and you should believe it and make it a part of your life, you'll be lost. That's how serious this occasion is. And at the same time, I'll be lost for having taught it to you. So I'm not unconscious of my responsibility. I have what in my mind is a very beautiful lesson for today. I don't know that I'll be able to deliver it that way. In just a few moments, we want to consider the kind of women that are needed in the church today. And then this evening, from 1 Peter 2 and verse 17, I want to talk about four great admonitions that are mentioned in that verse. And this verse has a very special meaning to me, because a few years ago, when I was writing my master's thesis, it's this verse that gave me an idea. And I'd like to tell you about that, and at the same time tell you the wonderful lesson that is contained in the verse. So I trust you'll be back tonight. Today, as I'm sure all of you are aware, is the last Sunday of February. And then comes March. And the third Sunday in March, if I have it correctly in mind, and I think I do, we begin our meeting here with Brother David Newberry. And the last Sunday in March, I have scheduled a meeting with Brother Charles Pugh, our former minister here in Waverly, and will be away on that Sunday. So the last two Sundays of next month, I'll not be speaking. So actually, I've said that to say this, that there remains two more Sundays for me to fill the pulpit here at Camden Avenue. And some of you might be saying how wonderful that is. I'll be glad when those two Sundays are gone. But I really don't believe that everyone feels this way, and I don't know that anyone does. It's been a thrilling experience in my life. And I trust it has been beneficial to you. And I'd like so much to have as many come and be with us tonight as you possibly can. And then certainly think in terms of the next two Sundays. And as many as possible, we certainly would like to have you on those two Sundays as well. And then our meeting coming up, we certainly want to have a full house that day. And then we'll have a guest speaker the last Sunday. And then the first Sunday in April, we'll have Brother Tom Miller, and we want this to be one of our outstanding days. We want to give him a wonderful, wonderful welcome. And so let's keep these Sundays in mind and try and be back tonight, the next two Sundays if you can, so far as my work here and that filling the pulpit, that is concerned. And now to the lesson which I have in mind, and this certainly is one that I have abundance of material with which to work. And there's no way that I could possibly give you all of the material that even God has provided with reference to the kind of women that we need in the church. And I think it would be well for us to begin again today, as we have on the past two Sundays, so far as advertising the subjects and giving the first lesson. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. And this is just as true in the life of a woman as it is in the life of a man. In fact, I trust I can draw from some outstanding examples Examples that will inspire all of us, and especially those of you who are women, to live more noble lives in the service of our Lord. I owe so much to women. If you were to take from me all that I've learned from women, I wouldn't know what I know today. I don't know all of that much to begin with, but I wouldn't know nearly as much as I do if you were to take from me all the things that I have learned from women. Not long ago, I received a letter from one of my former Sunday school teachers. It's been perhaps a little longer than I realize, and yet it hasn't been all that long anyway. When my mother passed away, my Sunday school teacher was then about 90 years old, still living an independent life, living in her own apartment. And we continued to write until she was about 93, and she wrote then, as well as my students at Freed-Hardeman, and for that matter, as well as their teacher did, and does. And it was such a wonderful thing to hear from her all of these years. What a blessing to my life she has been. The lessons that she taught and the things that I preach today, many of them I learned from her. So the church today is blessed with a great number of outstanding women, and this has been characteristic of the church all along. And I don't think we have to limit ourselves to the church. You know, in 1 Corinthians 14, when Paul says that the woman is to be in subjection to the man, in the church that is as a Christian, he also adds, as also saith the law. Now there's one thing that we today, and particularly the women, have in common with the women who lived under the law, and that is to live in subjectivity. This does not suggest in any sense inferiority. It's simply God is a God of order, and He has set it up that God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. That's the law of God. And we have this one thing in common with the Old Testament: subjectivity. The law says that she's to be subject, and we are to remember this, as also saith the law. I say that to suggest this. In just a moment, I'll be calling our attention to some things that women did under the law, and yet they were living under the same law to which we're subject today, that women are to be subject to the man. And with God's approval, certain women did certain things that might even be surprising to some of us. And so I call this to your attention. In Acts 16, the record tells us of Paul's going into the city of Philippi, and there he met Lydia and certain of her household. And the record tells us in verse 14 that as Paul spoke the word of the Lord to her and those with her, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. I think of Lydia as an outstanding example for women today. And certainly in this respect, she is an example, that she was attentive to those things that were said. We need women in the church today who are willing to listen to what God says. And not only was she attentive to the things that Paul said, but the record says that as a result of this, she and her household were baptized. That is, she rendered obedience to that to which she had previously been attentive. She obeyed what she understood the will of the Lord to be so far as her life was concerned. We need women like that in the church today. Women who will listen to what the word of the Lord says and then conform to that. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 2, a passage that is, I'm sure, well known to all of us, Paul is writing telling Timothy how to conduct himself in the house of God, which is the church of God, and He tells them how he ought to conduct services in an assembly such as this. And he says that men ought to pray to God always, everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. And he's talking about men, specifically here. For in the next verse he says, verse 9, in like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearl or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. I want us to think about this just a moment, because I believe that here the Lord reveals to us something about what He wills women to be, the kind of women that He would have in the church. He's definitely drawn a contrast here. He said that I will that men pray everywhere. And He's putting a restriction upon women in this particular passage. Because after dealing with the men, He then turns to the women. And He says, in like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel. This is the kind of woman that we need in the church today. A woman who is willing to adorn herself in modest apparel. I really do not appreciate all the things that I have read from some of our brethren about women and their dress, because it seems, regardless of what the style might be, someone finds fault with the way women dress. And I know that women sometimes dress improperly. That's one reason why we have this passage. But we want to keep in mind that woman, after all, being the opposite sex, is attractive regardless. And you cannot condemn her for this, but it seems as though sometimes preachers want to do this. I've seen them in sack dresses. Do you remember the old sack dress? They were beautiful then. And I've seen them in rather tight-fitting dresses. They were beautiful then. It just doesn't make a lot of difference as to how they're dressed. I mean, so long as it's nice, neat, modest, they're going to be attractive. And so we do not condemn women for being attractive. At least we should not. You may not appreciate my definition of modesty, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. A modest dress, that is. It's a person who is dressed in such a way as, and I may not be a very good judge here, as to not cause special attention. That is, it is as improper, in my judgment, for a woman to be dressed in a sloppy manner as it is for her to be dressed with jewels and all kinds of extra fine array. One is just as improper as would be the other. Modest apparel is when you are with someone and you perhaps talk with the person, you see her, perhaps talk with her. And when you get home, someone asks, did you notice the dress that this lady had on? Well, I know I'm not a very good judge here, but most likely I would say no. That is, there wasn't anything spectacular about it. She was just dressed in a nice way, like everyone else dresses. If I understand what modest dress means, that's what it means. It does not mean that we have to wear dresses below our ankles all the time or just below the knee. It doesn't suggest this. It's just the fact that she's not dressed in such a way as to call special attention to herself, conspicuously. And then I appreciate this with shamefacedness. This actually has to do with the matter of blushing. The Lord says that the woman should not become so hard-hearted that she cannot blush. And did you know one of the greatest compliments that can be paid to a Christian woman is to say she blushed? There isn't a lot of falsehood about a blush. It's just spontaneous. You have no real control over it. And when an improper story is told, or an improper word is spoken, or an improper act is performed, and the Christian woman blushes in the presence of such, that, I believe, is the kind of women we need in the church. Not someone who is so scarred, and who is so hard-hearted, and so calloused that she's not sensitive to these things. I've heard, but I regret it, some women say, well, don't worry, you're not going to make me blush. Now, that's in this text. That's a part of her adornment. That's the kind of women we need in the church. Women who are truly sensitive to error, to evil. And in a sense, this is an involuntary reaction on their part. He says, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair or gold or costly array, or pearls or costly array. I don't think he's condemning women here for the manner in which they dress, that is, having gold and pearls and this kind of thing on. But it's when one dresses with these ornaments and comes to an assembly such as this, or for that matter walks out on the street, and she's thinking, I wonder if people notice how I dress. I wonder if they've seen my diamond. I wonder if they've noticed my golden earrings, or whatever it might be she has on. Are they seeing these things? Seeing in an audience like this, I wonder if they see how I'm dressed and the beautiful jewelry that I have. That's not the kind of woman we need in the church. Rather, we need one who is adorned. Not that it's wrong for her to be dressed like this, but her thoughts are on this. This is the thing she's concerned about. This is the way she's trying to draw attention to herself, if you will. And I don't know that that's a proper term to use either. But notice, still he says, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. That is, but with good works. Let the woman be adorned with good works. The things that makes her beautiful is what she does. And I know some beautiful women. I remember when I was just a little boy, about 11, maybe 12 years old, the man next door to my brother's business place married a woman, and the first time I saw her, I thought that undoubtedly is the ugliest woman I have ever seen. She had a nose about that long, and she was just plain ugly. But ever so often I'd go into this man's business place, and he had a little dart board there, and I used to go in and play on the dart board, and I went in one day. She said, would you like to play a game with me? And I said, oh yes. And you know, today, when I think of that woman, when I see her physical features just like I did the first time. But when I see her in my mind today, she is a beautiful, beautiful person. You see, I was judging her on the wrong basis, the way she looked physically. But it's what she did that made her beautiful. And she's beautiful in my mind today, and that's been years and years and years ago. She was kind. She was wonderful to be around. That's the kind of women we need in the church. Not that she was necessarily in the church, but that's the kind of women we need in the church. Women who become beautiful and attractive by the good works that they perform. And it's not something great necessarily that we do. Little drops of water, little grains of sand make a mighty ocean and a pleasant land. That is, it's the little acts that we perform, acts of kindness and words spoken, that makes a beautiful life. And that's the kind of women we need. I think we need women in the church like Priscilla. You remember Aquila and Priscilla? And they heard Apollos, and they took him aside and taught him the word of the Lord more perfectly. We need women who are willing to work with their husbands in this way. Women who are willing to share the responsibility of living the Christian life with their husband. Of course, the husband needs to share this responsibility too, but we're talking about women today in particular. And we need women in the church like Priscilla. She was willing to work with her husband, open her home, and invite someone in. And Lydia, for that matter, did the same thing. After she was converted, She said, now, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house. And she constrained us. It wasn't just a simple little invitation. She really meant what she said. And those servants of the Lord lived in her house for a time. We need women like this in the church. And then I want to make some brief comment about some of those characters in the Old Testament, and then go and turn our attention to Proverbs 21. There are just so many women that we could talk about here. After all, we're not talking about the Lord's mother. We're not talking about the women that worked with Him in His personal ministry, and all of these could be used in such a wonderful way to learn something about the kind of women that we ought to have in the church today. Women that worked together in the church, and women that worked with their husbands in the church, and women who were subject to their husbands and subject to men. That is not trying to take control. You know, I remember one woman that led singing in a congregation that had dwindled down to about 15 or 20 members. At one time, they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 or 300. I was there in a meeting. We were having an outstanding meeting. In fact, we carried sub-headlines in the paper, a thing that people never dreamed of. It was a marvelous meeting just outside Bloomington, Indiana. And we had a singing schedule for the afternoon, and she knew that the brethren had arranged for the man who was leading the singing in the meeting to conduct the program that afternoon. But before he was able to get up in the platform and make the introductory announcements and announce the song leaders, she started in and led the first song. She was definitely going to lead the song. Well, now, we don't really need that kind of women in the church. You see, it's one who is going to have her way. We don't need that kind of women. Oh, I don't mean that we do not want this kind of women. After all, we grow, understand. But we want to grow away from that. And again, this is not spelling inferiority. I just wish I could tell you all the things that I have in my mind about experiences that I've had. Well, I remember one time when I was in Bloomington, we had a couple there, and he was a little short man, just a little dried up thing, and he married a woman about so tall, you know, much taller than he was, and large. And I can still see them coming in the church with their little baby. I'll remember as long as I live. She always came in the church carrying the little baby and other things with her that she needed for the baby. And he always came in and behind her, walking behind her, carrying the bottle in his hands like this. Just a little fellow. Well, you tell me that she's not superior to him in any number of ways. Well, I'd say you're out of your mind. She was superior to him physically. I imagine she was superior to him intellectually. Just superior in most every way you could imagine. So we're not dealing with superiority and inferiority. That's not the thing. It's subjectivity. I'm subject to many people. I don't know that I'm inferior to them in any way. But I'm subject to them because that's the way it's set up. And so when we talk about subjectivity, let's not confuse this with inferiority. Because women are not inferior. They're superior in many, many ways. And in the New Testament we have so many. But now, in the Old Testament we have women too. For instance, Huldah. Huldah, on one occasion, the Lord said, I want the priest. That's in 2 Kings chapter 22, if you'd like to study this. I want the priest and the king and the scribe. Now just think of who that is. I want you to go to Huldah the prophetess and let her teach you something. I want her to explain this to you. Now, this woman was living under the same law that women live under in the church. We have this in common, that she's subject to the man. She's to be subject as also saith the law. So Huldah was living under this law of subjectivity. And yet she taught at the Lord's will the king, the priest, and the scribe. And then certainly you have not forgotten Deborah, that great judge in Israel. But now in both of these instances, of all the judges that we had, some 15 in number, she's the only one that had the assistant who was a man. And I believe that this was an indication of her subjectivity, even though serving as judge. She wanted a man there to help her. And Huldah was over here in a private situation teaching these men. So whenever you find something like this, if you look at it properly, I think you'll see that there is that idea of subjectivity being honored and recognized if it's a woman that God approves. But now, for the rest of the lesson, I'd like for us to consider this beautiful, beautiful section in the last portion of Proverbs, Proverbs 31, as we think in terms of the kind of women that we need in the church. A proverb, what is a proverb? A proverb is a true saying. It's just a true saying. The idea of it being fulfilled, the idea of it passing away, the idea of it not having anything to do with us, is really a misunderstanding, I think, of this marvelous reading. It's just a true statement. And he begins this wonderful reading that was brought to us in such an excellent manner this morning. Who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies? Oh, we need that kind of woman in the church. Yes, we do. A virtuous woman, that is one who is morally and physically fit. That's what he's talking about. Not necessarily a weakling, and certainly someone who has high moral standards. Well, no wonder he said, for her price is far above rubies. There may be some allusion here to purchasing a wife. I don't know that it is. But this is one whose price is so high that it would be very, very difficult to purchase her. Who can find a virtuous woman? A woman who is morally and physically fit, for her price is far above rubies. As he describes this person, he says, the heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. Again, no wonder her price is far above rubies. But we need this kind of women in the church. Women who are concerned about their households, who are concerned about their relationship with their husband, and their care for the home and for the husband. She shall do him good and not evil all the days of her life. What a beautiful picture this is. She seeketh wool and flax and worketh willingly with her hands. She's not afraid of work. In fact, she enjoys working. She finds delight in it. She is like the merchant ship. She bringeth her food from afar. She goes out if necessary, finds the best material at the best price. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. And if you've been around mothers with little babies, and the only kind of mothers really that I know, you know what this passage says. A little baby cries, and the dad should get up, I guess, but who usually gets up first? The mother. Well, we need mothers. We need women like this in the church. Nothing lazy about them. She considereth a field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. And I believe this is true today. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a vineyard, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a field. But she is ambitious, and she has commercial inclinations. That is, she wants to be involved in personal gain. And he says, this woman, her price is far above rubies. Well, no wonder he said this. She girdeth her loins with strength and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good, her candle goeth not out by night. You don't get the idea of someone who is negligent about the home, even negligent about her own person, negligent about her family. The thing that I want you to see here is a person who does not necessarily confine herself to the house, and yet her family, her home, is number one in her mind. Some people have the idea that if a woman is a keeper of the house, that she never gets out. Well, I have no objection to that. I had a mother, of course she's gone now. And not too long before she passed away, and she lived to be 89. It was several years, but not too long before. My youngest brother went to her home one day, and he wrote to me later, and he said, my mother was in the hospital at the time, and he said, R.C., today is the first time that I ever remember going to my home, my mother's home, and my mother wasn't there to welcome me. Oh, my mother was always there. And she was the queen of her home. That's a wonderful thing. She did work in the home. She did work in the home even to bring in money. But she never left the home. I think we need women like this in the church. I think my mother was a wonderful person. And I owe her much. And I'm glad that I can have this kind of memory of her. On the other hand, many women work outside. But that does not mean that the home is not number one in their thoughts. Maybe I should say number two, because the church should be number one. The home, that's it. She's the queen there. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretcheth out her hands to the poor. Yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She's willing to help people. We need that kind of women in the church today. One of the greatest advertisements that the church can have is women who are doing good to others. That'll do a lot more good than advertising in the paper, on the radio, over television. We need that kind of women. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. You see, she's not a slouch. She's well dressed. But her thoughts are not centered upon this. She's thinking in terms of serving the Lord and building her home. Her home means so much to her. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. I don't know that it was requested, but I would have requested it had I simply had an opportunity. I'm inclined to think that it was simply his own doings because he knew my mother-in-law. But when my mother-in-law passed away and they conducted her funeral, the young man who conducted her funeral read this chapter, this portion of this chapter. And I thought to myself, how fitting and what a marvelous choice of reading he has selected. My mother-in-law was a person who was very quiet, and yet she knew how to pass from one to the other in a congregation, and she wasn't there long until everyone knew her. Well, they knew Sister Jones. And of course they knew my father-in-law too. He's a rather extrovert himself, but not the same as my mother-in-law was. And I really believe that he was honored more because of her than himself. And I think this is the type woman we're dealing with here. Her husband is known in the gates, while they knew him because of her. Now, he has to have certain qualifications too, otherwise he couldn't be where he is. But his wife helped him to get there. You know, we need women like this in the church. Women who will stand behind their husbands and give them support. But when I read this, in your mind, who gets the greatest honor? Are you not seeing this woman instead of her husband? You see, just because you support your husband does not mean that you'll be robbed of an ounce of honor that is rightfully yours. That, in a sense, is your work. That's the woman whose price is far above rubies. And that's the kind of woman we need in the church. I know preachers, any number of preachers who are not preaching today because their wives did not encourage them. It is a sacrificial life. Have you ever known of many rich preachers? Somehow you just don't go in that direction as a preacher. And it's hard sometimes for a wife to stand behind a person of this kind and say, keep on, when she knows that all he has to do is just turn around and look in the other direction and he can make a fortune. But we need this kind of woman in the church. Someone who stands behind and supports her husband. And then she maketh fine linen and selleth it and delivereth girdles unto the merchants. Again, an ambitious, very busy type person. Incidentally, Lydia was like this. She was far, far from home. She's from Thyatira, you remember, when Paul met her in Philippi. There in business. A very prominent business in that day. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. Strength and honor. That's what adorns her. That's what makes her beautiful. She opened her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. And you know, when I read this, I thought of one of Shakespeare's characters, two of them in fact, King Lear, who had made such a terrible, terrible mistake in judging his daughter's worth and rejected his young daughter in favor of the two older ones, and then realized that that was a terrible mistake. In fact, that's one of the tragedies of King Lear. And as he looked down into her face after she had died, a very tragic death, he said her voice was ever soft, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman. Somehow that's appealing to me. Her voice is ever soft, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman. Well, that's what he says here. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. I don't think anyone could read this, a woman who is outside the home much of the time, and could interpret it with the idea that she's neglecting her home. She's living for her home. Her home is number two. Certainly the church should come first. But her home means everything in the world to her. That's one reason why she works. That's one reason why she finds pleasure in working. It's her home, her husband, her children. And then the next verse, her children rise up or arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. You know, last Sunday evening I sat and listened to one of our young men as he spoke to his peers and spoke to the parents who were present. And I could just imagine the feeling of his parents when he stood there and said, I love my parents. I love my father and I love my mother. Well, when children are reared properly, and this is an indication that that's what she did, the children will rise up and call her blessed. And we're not limited to this example here. When I was over at Ohio Valley, I made an assignment one day to have my class write a paper on, as I recall, a person who has had a great influence upon your life, some event. And in this, I can see something about you. It's sort of a biographical thing. One of our young men here chose to write about his mother. Well, naturally, when I read his paper, I thought of this. And when I read this, I think of his paper. The person who perhaps had the greatest influence for good upon him, he said, is my mother. He loved his father, but he loves his mother. And her children shall rise up and praise her. What a wonderful reward this is. We need women like this in the church. Women who will rear their children in such a way as to cause the children to respond in this manner. When I was at Freed-Hardeman College, I usually had the students write a biographical sketch of their lives. I'm very emotional, as I suppose most of you are aware by now. I cannot tell something that's sad and like other preachers can, and I cannot tell something that's funny. It affects me the other way just as much. I laugh at my own jokes too much. But I received so many sad papers that I quit making that assignment. I just decided, why should I punish myself this way? Some students were glad to be in college because they no longer had to live with their parents. Some were in college and told me that they would never have a right to go back to their home, that their parents had turned them out. Some of the saddest papers I have ever read, I have read from the hands of my students at Freed-Hardeman College. That's not the kind of parents we need in the church. That's not the kind of mothers we need in the church. Rather, we need this kind. The kind